So behind me is Dumbarton Rock, a massive example of the post-Roman rock fortresses. So massive and so grand, in fact, that it's a bit hard to get it all in shot with me while I'm actually at the place. Dumbarton Rock was the royal centre for the Kingdom of Strathclyde, sometimes called the Kingdom of Clut, both of which refer to the wonderful River Clyde running nearby. Strathclyde coming from the valley of the Clyde, and Clut, the rock of the Clyde, a reference to, of course, this wonderful rock fortress. And it's something that's very important in a lot of early medieval documents and histories. So, for instance, we know that the king of Clut was one of the warriors that would leave Edinburgh's Castle Rock in the fateful Battle of Caithrith, never to return, like most of the warriors from the Godavan elegies. Likewise, it shows up in a lot of other historical contexts until its destruction and abandonment in the 9th century, after it was sacked by the Norse raiders during the Viking Age. Although this is, of course, a wonderful defensive position to help monitor ship travel into Scotland through the River Clyde, and so it wasn't abandoned for particularly long, and the modern defenses you can see are from roughly the 16th century. But there's also a few historical references that are a bit spotty. So, for instance, what sort of people lived at Dumbarton? Were they Picts, or were they the Britons? Or were they another enigmatic group, the Atacotti? And of course, there's also a bit of debate as to whether this is referenced in the writings of St. Patrick. So the traditional narrative is that we had a single, relatively unified Celtic people living on Britain, the Britannoi, until the Romans invaded. And the Romans, of course, erected the wall separating Roman Britain in the south and Celtic Britain in the north. And that over the centuries of Roman rule, this divide came to be a bit of an ethnic divide as well, with the sort of Romano-British to the south and the barbarian Picts to the north. But like in a lot of these simple historical narratives, the truth gets a lot more complex, because the Romans didn't build a wall dividing Roman Britain from the barbarian Britain, but in fact two walls: Hadrian's Wall, the more famous stone wall in the south, and the Antonine Wall, an earth and timber construction slightly further north. And so, at places like Dumbarton, which sit between the two Roman walls, they have a very interesting place in sort of ethnic identity in the early Middle Ages. So while the names Clut and Strathclyde come from the references to the River Clyde, the name Dumbarton itself comes from the Old Gaelic Dún Breton, this being sort of the ancestor languages to the modern Irish, Gaelic, and Manx languages, and refers to the fort of the Britons. So we might say that from a historical perspective, it's quite clear that these people between the walls were considered Britons and not Picts. But in a lot of elements of their material culture, they quite more resemble the northern neighbours of the Picts than the southern Britons. So from an archaeological perspective, we might say that these are Picts. The kings of Dumbarton, the kings of Clut, when they were buried at the neighbouring church site of Govan, they actually used Pictish burial stones, which are incredibly similar, if not exactly, and arguably just simply are Pictish stones. Likewise, a lot of the fortresses, or some of the fortresses rather, in the area use what's called vitrified stone, the use of incredible amounts of heat to melt the rocks together, which does make the rocks more brittle, but also fuses them. So in some ways it could be considered making the sort of dry stone construction that we see a lot in Britain and Ireland during the post-Roman time a bit more stable and a bit more secure. So they occupy an interesting position between the two worlds that we would consider the Romanized Britons and the barbarian Picts. But even then, it gets a little more complicated. You see, while early medieval peoples generally divided what we might now call Scotland between those two people, the Britons and the Picts, as well as later on the Anglo-Saxons who started invading from the south, the late Romans actually possibly mention a third people group called the Atacotti. The Atacotti are very mysterious and don't become mentioned in any later medieval texts, or indeed in earlier Roman texts. They're sort of a specifically late Roman phenomenon. They're sometimes referenced as one of the peoples that emerged during the time of the emperors. They're mentioned in a couple raids, mostly against Britain, but also in Gaul. And they also supplied soldiers to the Roman army, creating a number of units known as the Atacotti. They're rather mysterious, and there's different theories as to where the Atacotti come from, usually Britain and the surrounding isles. The early church figure, St. Jerome, does specifically call them British, but it's worth noting that certain late Roman writers seem to have referred to British to mean not just Britain, but its surrounding other surrounding islands, sort of in the way people might use the British Isles today. So there's no reason that just because they're called British, we should expect them to be British in the modern sense, but could also be from places like Britain, the Orkneys, or Man. But to make it relevant here at Clut, one of the proposed etymologies is that Atacotti is in fact the romanization of Clut, and that the Atacotti were a reference to these federate people that are neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, that lived between the walls, sort of people like the Wodadini, the ancestors of the Godothan, and here at Strathclyde. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of other theories, and the idea that they were Irish is a particularly popular one. Whenever the Atacotti are mentioned, they're almost exclusively mentioned alongside the Irish. And in St. Jerome's text, the one that calls them British that I mentioned earlier, some versions actually do call them Scoti, which is to say the late Roman term for the Irish, rather than the Atacotti. Although there's also some theories that sort of marry those two ideas together. We know that during the late Roman period and into the early Middle Ages, the Irish were colonizing parts of Britain, suggested invasions and migrations into what is now Wales, Cornwall, and the Scottish Highlands. This theory then posits that the Atacotti are in fact the British Irish, just to say the Irish who have settled and are causing problems in Roman Britain. I don't actually find either of these theories particularly compelling. Not that I have my own theory, which I find more compelling, just it seems to me like it's one of those mysteries that we just don't have the information to solve at the moment. The kings here at Clut might also have made an appearance in the writings of St. Patrick. In the letter to Coroticus, which is one of two surviving written works by St. Patrick, he condemns Coroticus and his soldiers for taking slaves from his newly converted people in Ireland. There's been a tradition associating Coroticus with the British king Ceredic, who is in the genealogies of the kings here at Dumbarton. The problem is, all of the traditions around this are rather late. St. Patrick lived in the 5th century, and indeed the letter of Coroticus seems to be pretty well dated to his lifetime. There's no reason to doubt its authenticity. But it's not until later clerics write about St. Patrick, about 200, maybe even 300 years after Patrick's death, that they associate Coroticus as being Rex Alu, or the King of the Rock. And then it's even later still, although not quite as long, that Alu is described as being in Britain in these Lives of St. Patrick. And because these traditions are much older, there's good reason to doubt the authenticity of the idea that Coroticus was British, or even that Rex Alu was an authentic title that would have been recognized by his followers at the time. Some scholars do accept that he was Rex Alu, but question the Briton part being an even later tradition, and suggest that he was at places like Ella, which was the seat of the kings of the Northern Email, one of the extreme power bases in Ireland. And others, and I think I would have to agree with them, argue that Rex Alu itself is a bit too late to be trustworthy. And again, similar to the Atacotti, we simply don't have enough evidence to create a strong association with Coroticus from the letter of St. Patrick and any other seat of kings or dynasties. And that brings me here to the highest point of the Rock of the Clyde. You can see the wonderful river behind me. And that actually brings me here, back to Cork. I had intended to be able to show off a little bit more of that spectacular view from Dumbarton Rock out into the Clyde and the surrounding area. It really is gorgeous if you happen to be around. But unfortunately, just as you could tell, the wind that day was pretty terrible. I mean, those clips are after going through wind reduction and noise reduction and the editing. And still, I just couldn't get the rest of that last clip to be sort of usable in any way. But rather than just sort of abruptly ending at the end of that clip, I wanted to sort of quickly come on and thank you all for watching, and particularly thank you all for sitting through those incredibly windy audio there. Dumbarton Rock was the last place I went and visited on my trip. I'll have the link to the other YouTube video I filmed over in Edinburgh Castle down below, and I'll do a little bit of a self-plug and put my TikTok down below where you could see me go to a few other sites there, including if you want to hear me mispronounce Govan while I talk about it a couple times. I only found that out after I'd recorded those clips and edited and uploaded them. Somebody pointed out that I'd been mispronouncing it. But as long as you're not looking for correct pronunciations, I think the videos there are pretty good as well. So again, thank you for watching. I thought Dumbarton Rock was a wonderful site, and just a lot of neat history things that may or may not be happening there. And I look forward to seeing what sort of discussions going down in the comments.